This is a simple 1/2 inch seam down one side of the garment, and this is the one you'll use if you are going to just cut away the seam allowance using, or secure the seam edge using a pinking scissor. Just a matter of sewing all the way down, following a 1/2 inch seam. On the other side, I'm going to show you how to do a French seam, and this requires that you change the way you've got the fabric lined up. It's going to be wrong sides together. It's going to seem a little strange, but just follow me here. We're going to carefully line the edges up so everything is nice and even, and then we're going to sew a very scant 1/4 inch. So do not do a healthy 1/4 inch or you'll have to trim some away. Go ahead and maybe even mark it on your sewing machine so that you are inside the 1/4 inch seam. We're going to go all the way down to the bottom. I'm going to recommend that you make sure that your feed dogs are not borrowing fabric from the underside, so the bottom fabric traveling faster than the top fabric, or you're going to get to the end of your seam and find that the top fabric's longer, but they were cut together. So if that happens, you're going to need to take it apart and do it again. Use pins, that'll help. Two, one. Now on a French seam, the first step is to do that really scant 1/4 inch. If you're good at an 1/8 inch, I'm going to recommend doing an 1/8 inch. Now what we have to do is get that to have a very flat presentation on the inside of the project. And that was right sides out, by the way. You'll see why. Oops. It helps to grab the hot iron. And you're going to give that a really good steam pressing so that it is convinced that you want it to lay that seam allowance all to one side, to the same side. I don't care left or right, it doesn't matter. Once you've done that, you're going to turn this back inside out, and then here's my seam. I'm going to make sure we don't want to do this. See how my seam is not on the folded edge? That seam needs to be exactly on the folded edge. These are really beautiful seams and easily accomplished. So, if you want practice on doing a couture seam, do them this way. Great project to practice on. This is often how you would do an organza project or a sheer, batiste, all those kind of delicate fabrics. They need to have that seam protected. Okay, so now I want you to see our seam allowance, part of it is now going to be captured as we come by again. So remember, we have a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So I used a scant 1/4 inch. So if I now from here do a 1/4 inch, what we don't want to have happen is for this guy to be peeking out on the, if I take too small of a seam, we're going to have that. That's no good. So since this is a gathered skirt, this time I'm going to do a healthy 1/4 inch seam, and let's go on over here to the sewing station. I don't have my whippet on here, but I made sure her head was in the up position. So far, so good. And I'm going to tell you, when I learned how to do this technique when I was still in school, I, didn't think I had time for the iron and all of that. And so I frequently would have strings sticking out and sometimes pieces of it. And, I wasted a lot of time fixing. So I am now a firm believer in just take that extra, what did it take us, 10 seconds to iron that down and really carefully follow my seam allowance plan. I have no repairs to do. That's always a win. So once we've done this step, what we're going to do is, well, I have to pink the other seam allowance. So now actually, so I got really lucky. These are salvage edges, and typically we wouldn't leave salvages in our projects if they're going to be running through the washer and the dryer. The dryer likes to shrink that salvage and make it really misbehave. When they're going to be washed in the river, dried in a tree, we're okay. So we're leaving them in. I just got lucky. I didn't make a plan to have that be the salvage edge, but you know, if you think ahead, you could plan to do salvage edges on an open seam. And I think it might be true that we cut salvage to salvage for the skirt. So you can check on that when you get your kit. What we're going to do now, we are going to add 2 rows of gathering stitches. And you're going to want to do the first row right here at 1/4 inch. And the second row needs to be beyond the 1/2 inch because 1/2 inch is my sewing line, right? So I'm going to go to 3/4. And the reason I'm choosing 3/4 is because 1/4 inch will be directly between these two. And that makes a beautiful gathered seam because you've got control over what's happening with the puckers in between. When you're, I don't know, I've tried all sorts of cheating ways and they just don't have the nice laying down of that gather when you're done. So I'm just going to recommend do this, trust me, or go rogue and see if you can find a better way. Just make sure that those gathers look really nice when they're hanging down. We can press them really well. If they're puckers and tucks, you're just going to need to take it out and try a new method. All right, we'll go over to the sewing machine. We're going to use a long running stitch. So probably if you have an older machine and they're measuring on the face of your machine, if they're measuring stitches by stitches per inch, your numbers are going to be looking like 8, 10, 12, 14, 16. I want you to pick an 8 or 6. 10 is really a little difficult, so don't go there. On my machine, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4. So I'm just going to make it go to the longest stitch, and the bigger the number, the longer my stitch is. So I'll meet you over at the machine. We're going to start at a seam. This is helpful. And if you're really experienced, we can go all the way around and meet back over here. For anybody who's not very experienced with doing gathers, we're going to stop at the other seam. I'll talk about why later. Also, I am sewing with the, this is note to me, with the right side up because the bobbin thread is typically the easiest one to pull on most machines. So just a word to the wise. 3, 2, 1. All right, I'm back to the ironing station. I have done my 2 rows of stitching and I sewed with the right side up because generally speaking, sewing machines are calibrated for the bottom, the bobbin thread, to be just slightly tighter than the top thread, which makes it really easy to be the pull string. And I want the pull string to be the one I can see. I'm going to insert, well, first I found the midpoint between the side seams and I put a pin, center front, center back, and there's really no, it's only going to become center front because I'm going to pin it to the front of the bodice. It's identical both sides on the skirt. So now I'm going to tuck it inside my bodice. The bodice is inside out. I'm going to tuck it in. And we are not going to be sewing this plan where you sew just these two together and then you have to tuck that in and turn this under and finish it off. We're going to do like this, and then we are going to just zigzag the edge here and we're good. Or if you want to hand it in and somebody with a serger can serger all the way around yours, that's fine. We got ladies who like to run their serger, and that's an easy project. So I'm going to take that pin out. I also found midpoint on my bodice. I just took and lined up the underarm seams, put a pin. So we know center front bodice, center front skirt, center back bodice goes to the center back of the skirt. Then after I've done that, I pin my side seams together. I don't know, I would like to start with the centers. All right, and here when I pin this, I literally pin it right on the seam, and I am trying hard to get that to match up with the bodice seam. You know, if you're off by a 1/16 of an inch or something, we're not really going to complain. All right, and then I'm going to do the other side. I do try to handle them carefully because, as you can see, the stitching does like to start getting loose, and if it gets loose much farther, I'm gonna have to go in and restitch. All right, matching those seams up and the raw edges, and I'm putting my pin. Now I might on this side is where I did a flat open seam, not the French seam. So I'm actually going to put a pin on both sides. What's happened here? Accidentally sewed over the tail. And the reason is I've got starting strings here and there, and when I move this pin out of the way, I don't want that one to release. So I have to find my tail. He's wandered off somewhere. There he is. And this one. Okay. So I've got these two tails I'm going to grab and start gathering. And I can just, if I want to, just gather to this point, and then I can move over here and gather to that point. And that is why I was saying for some of you, you may want to just only go halfway around, because then you're not gathering quite as much at a time and running the risk of the string breaking. If it breaks, you're going to have to restitch the whole section. So if you went all the way around and it breaks when you're about this far, you're going to have to take it off of the bodice and restitch that whole thing. So, you know, sometimes just that little second it took to stop and start again so that you didn't have that problem, it's worth it. So I'm going to gather until this lays flat. And once it's done that, I'm going to go ahead and do like a little figure 8 around my anchor pin, and that's going to hold it from letting loose. Now I'm going to lay it down, and I need these gathers to be evenly distributed in this section. I just usually use my fingernail. If you have too many in one spot, it's going to stick out on the girl. That's why a dress will do that. So, you know, just keep working them until they're really laying nicely. And you can get them all the way up to that pin. So see that? That's really going to look good. Now I can move on to the next section. And sometimes as I sew, I'll see a spot that I didn't do well, like right here. That does not look very good, actually. So let's get a few more over there. And there we go. So don't worry about it if, as you're sewing your way around, you decide, oh, I need to do a little more. So I think pins are your friend. Let's go ahead and add a few pins along the way. Always take them out. Don't sew over them, please. When I was a girl, I didn't believe my mother about that. And I just always sewed over them, and I broke many needles doing it. And one time, I broke a needle, fractured a needle, and a piece of it flew right into my eye. Lucky for me, my eye had a really fast reaction and closed, but I had a bleeding eyelid. So I was ever after convinced I don't run over pins anymore. I appreciate my eyes. All right, so now I'm just on the other side seam, the opposite side seam, and I'm going to pull. You can only pull so far, and then you're going to have to advance those gathers. Okay, and it doesn't matter about the distribution at this point. I just need to keep going until it lays flat. All right, I generally go a little bit more because it tends to relax a little. So same thing, I'm going to go ahead and put another pin here so that each section of string has its own anchor pin. Anchor it. You don't have to do the whole string, but get a good bunch of it on there, because if you don't, trust me from experience, it will wiggle its way off there when you're doing this, because we're pulling on it as we stretch these out. So my mom always used a pin to do this. I don't know, maybe I should try it. She was a good seamstress, so it probably was yeah, actually. I think it does a better job of minutely spreading them out. All right, so now you see how when we have this distance here, I'm going to come right down the middle of that at the 1/2 inch mark, and they're not going to have an opportunity to get crazy on me and make a pleat instead of a gather. So that's why 2 rows is definitely the superior way of doing this. I'm going to do the other half, and then I'll meet you at the sewing machine. Now at the machine, you're going to want to make sure that you have changed your stitch length back to a 2.5 or 12 stitches to the inch. And before you get started sewing, I'm going to recommend that you move the long tails, the bobbin thread and the top thread, to the top of your project so you can see them. Otherwise they're going to want to get stitched over and trapped and make it hard for you to remove the left row of stitching when you're all done, because that row will show, as will the tails of the top row if they have gotten trapped by your sewing. So right now you're watching me pull my long strings to the top of the project, and then I'm going to move the left row of strings to the left and the right row of strings to the right so that they aren't in my way, and I'll have to do that again on the other side seam. You could do this at the same time that you're pulling them. That's probably the smart way to do this. Once you've made it all the way around the waistline, you're ready to remove the bodice from your sewing machine and prepare to do the hem.